The original Final Fantasy shaped me. So much of my love for RPGs, my internal understanding of what it means to go on an adventure, all stems back to that quaint little game. It produced ripples across the video game industry that we still feel today. For example, the entire plot collapsing in the last 2 hours as you head to space or another dimension to fight a villain that you've never seen before. It's so cool. The game, alongside Dragon Quest, challenged the notion of console RPGs being an impossibility, and did things that simply blew people away. This was the most impressive guy of all time. Final Fantasy II is not that. It's a deeply flawed experience, flawed to its core, to the point where it seems that no amount of revamping the visuals or growth patterns can truly help it. That being said, the atmosphere this game is able to create through the death, the desperation, and the sheer evil that resonates from the Empire is truly unique. To take such a whimsical title like the original Final Fantasy and in under a year craft something so dark and moody is pretty impressive, considering that half the visuals were entirely reused. Final Fantasy III is the title preceding Final Fantasy IV. Though knowing this series, I could be wrong. I mean, come on, guys. 16 released a decade ago. Final Fantasy III has always been the odd man out, the singular numbered entry that was left to rot on the NES. And when the DS remake finally brought the game out of Japan, it was presented in a super different manner. That original NES version is a game that very few Final Fantasy fans have touched, and as a result, its reputation is a little bit blurry in regards to the larger conversation. Now, that's not to say that this game isn't loved. It has its fans, but even with the Pixel Remaster, which is the version that I played, it's one of the least reviewed Final Fantasy games on Steam, and I don't think I know anyone that's ever played it, which is telling, because I went to the Final Fantasy III convention. As for myself, I did dabble a little bit with the remake, but I do gotta say, I didn't like it. Was it a result of the remake being less than stellar, or... No, I think it was just because I was 7, so I am disregarding all preconceived notions of this stupid little piece of crap. I'm gonna really dig into it, see what makes it tick, and try to figure out whether or not it deserves to be overlooked, or if everyone else is a stupid piece of crap. Before I get any more sleep, I'm figuring out what makes this game unique. The answer was surprisingly harder to find than I thought. So to answer the question that everyone is always asking of me each time I leave my house to not file my taxes, I think I recorded this actually already. Final Fantasy III is a good game, but about 4 or 5 asterisks after that, though. 3 comes in 2 very distinct flavors, the original experience or the revamped 3D version that was originally released for the DS. Despite the story mostly being the same, you'll get a completely different experience depending on which one you choose to play. The version I played for this video was the Pixel Remaster from a few years back, which takes the framework of the original, but adds quality of life improvements, slight gameplay changes, alongside making changes to the endgame, as the original was notoriously miserable and difficult for all the wrong reasons. With all that said, the original Final Fantasy III had to accomplish a lot. Final Fantasy I had made waves, and the sequel hadn't really done that. It had sold better than the original, but without a release outside of its home country, it was never able to match in lifetime sales. On top of this, there were a lot of problems surrounding the quality of the game itself. It had ditched so much from the original in favor for really weird progression systems. So for 3, they took just a little bit longer for development, and while it too never got a worldwide release, the sales in Japan were extremely strong. Which makes sense, considering the game pulls so much from the game that people universally liked. Once again, we find ourselves with the Save the 4 Crystals plot that aims to match the vibes of Final Fantasy I's bright, bubbly world with that history of advanced magic and civilizations. But instead of being a beat-for-beat repeat of what the devs knew would work, they instead leaned into the idea of one-upping the stakes anytime they could weasel something in. For example, you get an airship like 15 minutes into the game before any other mode of transportation, but immediately you slam it into a rock to clear a mountain pass because an earthquake has destroyed, like, the entire world. I think the fact that you're just a bunch of idiot kids dressed up like onions or whatever goes a long way in establishing the stakes right out of the gate in comparison to the Warriors of Light from the original Final Fantasy. And much like FF1, your first task involves saving a princess just like Sarah and Corneria, but instead of being the stereotypical damsel in distress, she heads into the dungeon alongside you in order to save her kingdom after they've been turned into... She then falls in love with you, and my name made it epic. The game is constantly trying to one-up its predecessors like this. In Final Fantasy I, you may have traveled underwater for a dungeon, but here you straight up get an airship to explore the entire ocean floor. There are more examples of this, but we'll swing back to them later on when they're more relevant. In most ways, it seems that the core design philosophy for Final Fantasy III was to just take everything that the first game had done and just ramp it up to 100. An expanded and dynamic job system, a less rigid story structure, an overall higher level of difficulty. It feels like a huge leap forward for the series, and it's a game that feels like it got the absolute most out of its original hardware. There's also a lot of stuff that makes me want to bash my head into a funky shape. Bosses can be just the worst. The magic spamming here is absolutely atrocious. It results in most bosses having a complete lack of strategy, as absolutely pummeling it with extremely high powerful attacks is by far the best approach, outside of the very choreographed times that certain jobs are going to be needed, which is by itself kind of like a waste of a job system, but again, we'll get into that. It's also a lot easier to spam attacks than in previous games because of the increased prevalence of type matchups and more magic charges. I mean, why would I go for any strategy outside of brute forcing everything when most big fights see your party slammed by wave after wave of screen nuke special attacks? Most boss fights end up boiling down to see which side can do the same thing longer, which admittedly was a problem in the previous two games, albeit it's markedly more frustrating here. This also means that a lot of the jobs that don't directly deal the most damage aren't going to be all that useful. Things like the Geomancer and the Thief. There are simply better alternatives that will fit pretty much every situation better. That's not to mention the job system intentionally making about half of its own jobs completely irrelevant. The heavy emphasis on gimmicks like shrinking down to fit into tiny dungeons, never being more enjoyable than just playing the rest of the game. This is an experience that is far from perfect, and suffers in certain places that the series had yet to suffer in. At its best, Final Fantasy III is the most engaging game the franchise has seen yet, pushing the boundaries so far outside of what had been done prior, yet this innovation leads to an undeniable polished problem that results in this, I don't know, being that one roller coaster in the amusement park about 45 minutes from your house that flings a kid or two from time to time. You know? In the end, though, it's fun, it's a good RPG, and I imagine at the time it was super exciting. Yet I also imagine that quite a bit of my enjoyment comes from the fact that I'm not playing that original version, a sentiment I don't share with this game's core inspiration. Regardless of the version you play, though, there are two truths to Final Fantasy III that are undeniable. This game is where the series really begins to hit its experimental, grandiose stride that allowed for 4 to take the best of all 3 and blast the series into the stratosphere a few years later. In fact, this game lays out the groundwork for what would pretty much be the entire series moving forward, and as a result, it feels strikingly more modern and exciting than the first 2 entries. This is, in the end, what makes the game so unique, and in a perplexing way, unremarkable. So how did the game that shaped Final Fantasy establish what the series was gonna be end up being one of the least celebrated games in the series? I don't know. I haven't wrote the script yet. When I think back on retro RPGs, and I'm talking that good stuff, and no, I'm not talking about heroin. I'm talking your early Dragon Quests, Chrono Trigger, Breath of Fire, those games whose core components still make up a large part of their genre. When I think of this stuff, it makes me feel warm. Most people nowadays, though, have a slightly more visceral rejection. I don't like this. And the biggest knock that I hear against retro games in general is the oftentimes very cryptic nature of quest progression. And sometimes this is entirely earned. Stuff like Ocarina of Time's Rolling Goron, which requires you to hit it with a bomb, unprompted in a manner never before done in order to progress the story. You know, great. Situations where just a tiny bit more context would have been a boon to frustration levels for kids all across the globe, and adults because we can't read minds. Well, to my surprise, my playthrough of Final Fantasy I was devoid of moments like that, and while sometimes I did have background knowledge to fall back on, that wasn't always the case. Generally, the story progression was made very clear by NPCs, or simply by what locations were available and when. Final Fantasy III takes this and applies it to a far less rigid story structure. Despite sticking to a setup that mirrors the original game, the flow of FF3's adventure more resembles its direct predecessor. By that I mean there are more than 4 main dungeons, and the story at many points redirects to focus on other important tasks, like getting your ship unchained by a dude who lives in a gold mansion, turning into a gnome. Isn't he epic? You have to ascend the Tower of Mike. You climb to a mountain peak, then get picked up by Bahamut, taken to her nest, and nearly destroyed before running away with the freak whose name is Deck. Yes, the 4 crystals are here, and you go and save them, but the quest is far larger than just that. In the Final Fantasy I video, I described its wholly focused nature as a strength, but here I would argue that having as many side objectives as this game does is a separate strength, because it helps lend to the whimsical tone the whole experience is going for. Everything, especially the first half, is so goofy and fun. Each time I crash an airship into a mountain, or become a gnome, or have an enemy channel me back to the dwarves cave from inside my shadow, I smile, because it's just silly, and it leans very heavily into it. Having so much more going on allows for the story to pop a bit more than the original too, because there are far more moments where the characters actually talk or do things. Now, this is not something that Final Fantasy III started. In fact, as a whole, the story is far less important here than it was in 2. Less character, less emotional weight and emphasis placed on it. But the fact that the story was still here and better expressed through more character animation and bombastic visual set pieces establishes a story-centric structure as something the series was going to stick to. And it did, so point for Final Fantasy III! I think the game does a very good job of making clear what needs to be done from a lot of different levels. Generally speaking, unlike the original, very rarely does more than a handful of locations get opened up at once, meaning that if you happen to have missed where the dialogue was pointing you, just ride around for a couple minutes. There's like 2 places you haven't been to yet. For a very short period of time early in the game, all that you have is a ship, which is helpful for exploring the tiny bit of the world which is made available, as everything has been split up by caves and dungeons and such. But by the end of your adventure, you have 2 completely different airships, one that can submerge underwater and the other which can cross mountain ranges. And while this means that you don't actually get an airship which is as useful as what you got in the first 2 games, which I will admit kind of annoys me, it does mean that every single location doesn't have to be opened as soon as an airship is accessible. First, you get the underwater areas to explore, and then you can explore deep into the mountains. In general, I think it's a cool way to break things up. And forcing you to progress through the mountain ranges in a very specific way means that once you get the airship, you can't always plunk right down next to your location, skipping random encounters in the world map altogether. A lot is done with the overworld here too, needing the really fast airship to get through a strong wind current, having the densest mountain ranges turned into a short maze. The structure of the world itself is very creative and more interactive than anything we had seen prior. Though nothing about the world is quite as important to the series as the introduction of the first multiple world map adventure. This becomes a staple for the franchise over its next most impactful era, having these huge shakeups by shooting you to a whole different world to explore after a certain point in the game. With this, fake endings can be crafted, difficulty spikes can be better choreographed, and stakes can be raised in really creative ways. In Final Fantasy III, you start off on a floating continent that, in comparison to previous world maps, is incredibly small. Now, you probably wouldn't have really known that fact when playing through the original, but it's something that is made super apparent by, you know, convenience features that kind of damage the original intent of the game, and the manual, I guess, probably. But only about 5 to 6 hours are spent there, because after getting your second airship, you fly right off the continent into a completely flooded world, which is something that you were told about if you were talking to NPCs, but seeing it is really impactful. Keep in mind that the 4 fiends in Final Fantasy I were destroying the world over hundreds of years, but here, a singular earthquake somehow caused this. This is insane! A wonderful way to raise the stakes over anything we had seen prior. Now, eventually you do unfly it, and it turns out the whole world had gills, I guess, because why is everyone just okay? This is something that actually really bothers me. The whole world gets submerged in water, and I don't ever think you're actually given a reason as to why when it recedes, everyone just is fine. On a similar note, why were 4 children able to walk through lava while taking no damage? Oh lord, my head's starting to hurt. Once everything is back to normal, you end with roughly the same amount of space as the original, just presented to the player in a slightly deceiving way. It makes the game feel that much bigger, and then once you go underwater, there isn't much. But it's still a really, really cool idea. It makes the game feel more dense, you know? This idea of multiple fields to explore is something the series would do a lot moving forward, and it made a really big impact with this first attempt. But it's not just the story structure that saw an overhaul. The core gameplay receives a lot as well. Gone is the rigid one-and-done job system of the original, and say goodbye to the all of Final Fantasy II. 3 adds so much that the series would take to heart and continue to cherish. My favorite additions to the overall overall experience are the random dungeons that you can just never find. Sometimes they're full of loot, and one occasion is to prep you for a future dungeon gimmick. And we obviously can't forget about the dungeon within the final dungeon that gives you all of the strongest weapons and access to the 2 best completely optional jobs that crack the endgame skull open like a watermelon between the thighs. But most of the dungeons have to do with obtaining all of the strongest summons, which aren't super notable outside of Bahamut being outrageously powerful, but strong optional spells to go out of your way for, that's meaningful content. Good on the devs, man, they deserve a Quiznos sub. Side content is very important to RPGs, and if you're gonna go entirely linear with an experience, you have to make sure that core campaign is enough to make up for the lack of player expression. Final Fantasy I had some side stuff, primarily extra chests in the early game to backtrack and find, alongside a short quest related to getting a strong weapon for the night, and you can't forget about the Job Ascension quest that, while optional, is psychotic to turn up and nearly impossible to miss. But despite the brevity of these activities, I appreciated them. Makes the world feel a little bit bigger and gives me more of a reason to explore. 2 didn't really have anything like that. It was one of the many things that unfortunately didn't carry over from the original. Progression was more or less a straight line there, and believe me when I say that the main dungeons were strong, but more in a I'm gonna kill you way. 3 doesn't put anything important in stupid locations. Like I said, your next destination is pretty easy to figure out. But within the locations themselves are tons of hidden passageways to loot and extra areas to find. Now, this is far better choreographed in later versions of the game, but I simply love this idea because it encourages me to spend more than 5 seconds in a given area, because a lot of times the items that you can find are going to key you into certain jobs that are about to be emphasized. So having a large number of completely optional dungeons and spells is not only an obvious plus because side content good, but it totally fits the way that exploration is emphasized in the main campaign. Because of this, there's actually a reason to go back and explore early areas, something that the previous games never really gave all that much importance to, other than like the handful of chests 5 hours into the original. And the entire final dungeon. So even though Final Fantasy III was built on the same hardware as its predecessors, the world feels far more akin to the games that it would inspire. That's honestly very impressive. I wonder if there's a reason as to why nobody talks about it. Oh, but the biggest, most impactful addition to the series here, no doubt, is the completely revamped job system. While Black and White mages have gained an undeniable level of importance to the series' iconography, the vast majority of the rest of the franchise's important designs come from Final Fantasy III's job system. Your party starts out as lowly onion knights, little stupid idiot kids who are ugly, but quickly, through the blessing of rocks, you can turn into a warrior, or a mage, or a black belt. Not a thief initially, but whatever. Later on, you can become a geomancer, a Viking, absolute series staples like Dragoon, Dark Knight, Summoner. While in the grander scheme of things, classes only exist in a handful of mainline Final Fantasies, especially if you discount tactics, though I don't, because it's simply too epic. But even games that don't feature a customizable job system, games like 4, 6, 9, and 10, all lean heavily into a lot of the archetypes established here. Thieves can finally steal, knights can defend, dragoons can jump off screen for a supercharged attack next turn, something which is still cool every time I see it. Geomancers can summon the power of the weather. Summoners are a more gimmicky and flashy alternative to standard magic. Without the groundwork that this first job system introduced, Final Fantasy as we know it today would not exist, because most of the memorable concepts wouldn't either. What's really smart here is that the first wave of jobs you obtain are all ones from the original Final Fantasy, so players would already know how this stuff works at a fundamental level. Except this time you can shuffle things around, so who knows what kind of challenges will be thrown at you when your capabilities are so malleable. That's what makes this fundamental concept for a job system so fun, slowly uncovering more as the game progresses, going from simple to complex, unveiling creative new strategies to tackle challenges. This lives on to some extent in pretty much every Final Fantasy moving forward. To some extent.
You wouldn't have known it at the time, but Final Fantasy III is when we really see the franchise come into its own. So much of what makes the franchise wonderful is here for the first time. So why does nobody talk about it? Final Fantasy III has its fans. I'd hesitantly call myself one, but the claim that it's the least appreciated mainline entry, at least through the first 10, is like factual. Despite everything that it did for the franchise, it doesn't get recognized to the extent a game like, I don't know, Dragon Quest III does. This is unfortunate, no doubt, and I'm not really sure how I'm going to recover from it, but regardless, I think there's a couple pretty obvious reasons as to why. First off, most people didn't get to play it for a very long time. Final Fantasy 1, 4, and 6 are beloved on the English-speaking internet because they were available to play. in North America at least. 3 vastly different games to dig into, with decades of nostalgia having built up. 2 and 5 took a little bit longer, releasing compilations on the PS1 and also on the GBA. 3 just festered alone. Why am I feeling sad? Okay, this is ridiculous. For those savvy with emulators, they could have played the game with a fan patch, but like, that's not really viable, is it? Not for a whole fan base to experience a mainline entry. It's like trying to argue that the lost Super Nintendo Fire Emblems don't need to be remade or re-released because the fan base has emulated them or played them with fan carts. Bro, most people don't do that. I don't have time to play the games that I actually paid for. Why would you think I'd go out of my way to mess with a janky emulator? Port the game. Nintendo. Port the game. The first time Final Fantasy III was properly released outside of Japan was the 3D remake, which was very different, and I don't know, I played it when it came out, and I didn't really think it was all that. Now that I've played 3 in full, I certainly don't feel apathy to it like I did the DS version. Maybe it was just that as a remake, I expected more than a game that heavily resembled 5, just not nearly as engaging. That is the second problem. Without that deep, widespread nostalgic attachment to the class system, and the multiple airships, and the reveal of the flooded world in the insane final act, people aren't going to talk about it, especially not over going to the moon in 4, or the explosion of the world in 6, or literally anything that happens in 8, though I'd argue 3 is better. While it's true that a lot of the aspects of the series that people adore are here and probably started here, how do I put this? I like Final Fantasy III, like, I enjoyed it, but it's probably one of the weakest games in the series. Not primarily because of a host of flaws, though it has that, but because it's been outdone in nearly every way by a later title. Final Fantasy IV takes a lot of the ideas that 3 had for jobs and places them into a story that's far more engaging and character-driven. So while you can't directly choose which classes are at your disposal at what time, the Dark Knight has a lot more to it, and so does the Summoner, and the Ninja, and the Monk, and all of them. It gives you the tools that you need, so while player expression is indeed reduced, all of this works in regards to telling the story and having more fleshed out personalities. 6 and 9 did very similar things, but with more fleshed out ideas. Like this. Final Fantasy X and 12 take the archetypes of classes established all those years back and create something completely different with them. Of course, we can't go on without mentioning Final Fantasy V and Tactics, the 2 games in the series that took that job system established in 3 and cranked it up to 1,000,000 with huge layers of depth and customization. Not sold? Alright, I'll keep talking. 4, 5, and 6 all take the idea of multiple world maps introduced in 3 and goes way, way harder on fleshing them out. Crazier ideas and more impressive set pieces. When you talk about multiple world maps in a Final Fantasy, you're gonna talk about 6, and how the second half of the game completely blows all expectations out of the water in regards to visuals, tones, story structure. So while the flooded world and ocean floor of 3 are really cool and impactful, people had already seen the idea of multiple world maps done to a bigger degree by the time this game even left Japan. So why would you go and rage about it? It's outrageous. This game is cool in context to the series, but these games are cool no matter how you chop them up and eat them. And all of this, in all honesty, is not to bash Final Fantasy III, it's more to complement its ideas. Now, it'd be a really different story if 3 was some unsung masterclass of game design, but I'm sorry one guy in the previous comment section that asked me to make this video, I love ya, but I might offend you here. The class system is designed in a way that the most simple of classes tend to be the most effective at dealing damage and generally managing the pace of battle. And all of those original classes straight up get upgrades as well, Warrior to Knight, Monk to Black Belt, Black Mage to Magus. So there aren't as many unique classes here as you might think. Furthermore, job level isn't really all that important. Most of the time it won't even feel like it's doing anything, and you can't mix and match abilities like in later titles. Some classes also feel way too gimmicky without the payoff. Why would I use Geomancer over a normal magic spell if the payoff has a solid chance to just suck? Why use a Dark Knight over a normal Knight if they take so much freaking damage for no reason and barely deal any more out? Scholar is literally worthless outside of a single fight that lasts like 5 or 6 turns, so that's a completely wasted spot. While the vibe of dungeons are cool and the flow of the adventure is very solid, I don't really like the world design itself because it doesn't feel like it could actually exist. Much like the rest of the game, the world is kind of wacky and goofy in structure, and like, This isn't a problem, but I do highlight it because of how great the world design was in the original Final Fantasy. And despite there being a lot more to engage with here, I don't really think it outdoes that original world. Dungeons outside of the endgame at least are extremely short and linear, so despite there being a lot of them and 2 whole world maps to explore, when you couple their brevity with a straightforward quest progression, the game ended up running shorter than the original Final Fantasy and almost 50% shorter than my playthrough of 2. And a lot of the dungeons aren't particularly fun or engaging either. I don't really see the point in dungeons where you gotta shrink down. Like, it's kinda cute the first time, but it really isn't all that entertaining. There's one where all of the enemies replicate if you attack them with anything other than a katana, which is like, what? So you're gonna force me to use a certain class for an entire dungeon instead of letting me find some kind of fun solution around it? It's just so restrictive for no payoff. It's kind of lame. The Pixel Remaster is the only version of the game not to feature some kind of penalty for changing classes, and events like this are frequent enough that I imagine it could have been a massive pace killer that only serves to stifle creativity within the game's most inventive system. Honestly, I can forgive a lot of these problems because it is indeed the first time the series had attempted most of this, and overall it does a generally good job on most fronts. But it's not a hidden masterpiece by any regard, and it's not a train wreck worthy of a warning. And to top that all off, all of its original ideas were harnessed and used by far more accessible, enjoyable games. I mean, why attach yourself to a similar yet inferior title that you got after what it inspired? If not for nostalgia, I can't think of anything. And there is a subsection of the fanbase that has a huge attachment to that DS remake, and I get it, and I respect it wholeheartedly. And while I can't really confirm this, I imagine that Japanese players see this game in a very different light. But they're over there, and I'm here. And statistically, you are probably here too. I hope I've sounded fair here. I don't feel like any of this is particularly groundbreaking commentary, but I've seen so few people talk about it that I thought it was worth shouting out in the airwaves. It is my opinion, and our empire is the center of the universe after all. I will say, I do feel kind of weird about having finally sit down and played through the first trilogy of Final Fantasy games and come out the other end thinking that the first game was the best one. And if my ranking stays that way, I'm going to be dead far before the everyone's dead theories actually start. I'm not too worried about that though, because the next game on our list is an unapologetic banger. So get on your grind and your ham and gear, because I'm gonna assault you. I'm gonna kill you with love. This video is supposed to come out around Valentine's Day. So in lieu of flowers, send money and not pipe bombs.